You know, I was really hoping to review Ben Shapiro's version of Snow White this week, but it looks like that movie's just not going to come out. Ever. So, since the Republicans have let me down, again, let's see if the communists can do a better job humiliating Disney. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. Now, this will be the second video that I'm doing for Women's History Month. And I figured, what better way to continue the celebration than to talk about a female character that has been an icon to so many for generations now. So this week, in continuation of Women's History Month, as well as tying into the new Disney live-action remake, I thought that it would be fun to go back and take a look at Snow White from 1961. Not to be confused with Snow White and the Three Stooges, also from 1961, oddly enough. Now, full disclosure up front, I'm not really a fan of the original Disney animated Snow White. I don't think it's a bad film, not by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I actually rewatched the film recently and I had a pretty fun time with it. I mean, obviously the animation is gorgeous. I do have a couple critiques regarding the clashing of animation styles between rotoscope and caricature. And I also think that the lack of shading on so many characters is kind of distracting, particularly on the human characters. But overall, it's an absolutely beautiful animated film that in a lot of ways looks even better than a lot of animated projects that come out today. Additionally, I also think that the character of Snow White is quite charming and likable, and in a lot of ways is actually pretty well written. And I also find the dwarf characters themselves to be very well characterized and very fun comic relief. But overall, I do feel like the original Snow White film is a bit too drawn out, and is narratively lacking in a couple key areas. Like the fact that the only character in the film that actually has kind of a character arc is the character of Grumpy, or the fact that the love story in the film between Snow White and Prince Charming is so drastically underdeveloped. Like, it's truly mind-boggling to me that that doesn't bother more people. Of course, all that being said, I'm just one asshole on the internet, and I'm allowed to voice my criticisms regarding a film that's almost 90 years old. I'm not associated with Disney, so I can pretty much say whatever I want. I mean, it's not like I was cast for a big-budget remake of a fairy tale movie that most people like, and then just start talking shit about it for some reason. That'd be really weird. Rachel Zegler. Oh, that's so weird that the cough I had from the last video hasn't gone away yet. Anyway, moving on from that, reviewing Snow White from 1961 actually marks a couple different milestones with my channel. For one thing, it is the first explicitly fantasy film that I'll be talking about on my channel. And for another thing, this is also going to be the first foreign language film that I'm going to review. This version of Snow White was actually made in Germany, which is actually quite fitting, because the original Brothers Grimm fairy tale was written in Germany. However, I feel like it is important to note that the film wasn't just made in Germany, it was made specifically in East Germany. For those of you who need a brush up on your history, East Germany was the half of Germany that was controlled by the Soviet Union for nearly 50 years. East Germany was basically a puppet state for the USSR, and following World War II, East Germany more or less completely embraced Soviet communism. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that even though there's no real visible Marxist influence on this version of Snow White, I do feel like it is still important to understand the cultural context of when a film was made and the nation it was made in. Not only that, but also me watching this film was also me being sort of subtly taken back into a culture that I'm not super familiar with, artistically speaking. Like, many people may not know this, but I'm actually a big fan of German films. Some of my favorites would include Goodbye Lenin, Downfall, and The Lives of Others. However, the thing about these three films specifically is that they were all made after Germany's reunification. And even with other German films that I've seen that came out before the reunification, like Wings of Desire or The Marriage of Maria Braun, those movies were both made in West Germany. So I've actually had very little exposure to East German films. In fact, I think the only two East German films that I have seen would be Divided Heaven, directed by Conrad Wolf, based on a book by Christa Wolf, no relation, funny enough, and The Legend of Paul and Paula, which, funny enough, is actually former German Chancellor Angela Merkel's favorite film. And, sorry to break it to you, Angela, but I find both of these films, especially Legend of Paul and Paula, to be both narratively lacking and poorly paced. That being said, going into this version of Snow White, I was interested to see how it would be different from a few different cultural standpoints. Not only how it would stack up against the original Disney animated film, but also how it would be told through a cultural lens of the country that the original story came from, as well as being made in a segregated half of that country. Like, there's sort of layers to dissect here that I'm kind of interested in. Especially considering that this is, like, the second German adaptation of Snow White. Apparently, West Germany also made their own version of Snow White in 1955, like 6 years earlier. So it's funny. But what happens in this version of Snow White? Well, we all know the story of Snow White. You know, she's a beautiful princess, hair as black as ebony, skin as white as snow. She has a wicked stepmother with a magic mirror. She has a meet-cute with a foreign prince that she's really interested in. She gets taken to the woods by the huntsman to get killed, but the huntsman doesn't have the heart to do it, so he just has her run off. She ends up finding the cottage of some dwarf characters, stays with them for a while. Then her evil stepmother, the queen, shows up in disguise, gives her a poison apple, the apple makes her go to sleep, the dwarves put her in a glass coffin, she wakes up, goes with the prince, lives happily ever after. Like, we all know the story of Snow White. But the devil is in the details. And something I was interested in watching this version of Snow White was seeing how small details would be different in this version of the story. Like, there's elements of the narrative that are kind of inconsequential, like the fact that in the film's prologue we actually get, an explanation of who Snow White's mother was. But there's so many other details in this particular adaptation that really set it apart. Like the fact that Snow White is not tricked once by the evil queen, but 3 times? If you recall from the original animated film from Disney, Snow White is told explicitly not to let anyone in the house, but she takes pity on this old woman offering her an apple because she sees the old woman is attacked by her animal friends. So Snow White's kindness and naivety in that situation sort of gets the better of her, and that's how she winds up in that situation. But in this film, it's so ridiculous. Because the evil queen, after finding out that Snow White is alive, tries 3 different methods to kill Snow White, and only the last one works. The first thing that she does is give Snow White, like, a cursed belt. The second thing that she does is give her a comb that's been poisoned with belladonna. And the third thing is the poison apple. And when I was watching these various plots unfold in the film, it was getting me really frustrated. Because it was highlighting the stupidity of not only the evil queen's character, but also Snow White's character. Like, I actually enjoy Snow White's character in this movie. I think she retains the charm and kindness that is vital to that character in her conception. And I also think that the actress Doris Wico does an amazing job in the role. But the fact that she falls for the evil queen's trick 3 times in this movie is just unforgivably stupid. And it just makes her character seem unbelievably gullible to a childlike degree. And moving on from Snow White to the evil queen, her character doesn't feel like a force to be reckoned with. She doesn't feel like a cruel villain. She feels like a villain of the week. Like, just a loser that has failed plot after failed plot. Like, it's actually really ironic that this version of the evil queen feels more cartoonish than the actual cartoon version. Now, I did read online somewhere that this particular version of Snow White was actually more accurate to the original Grimm fairy tale than most other adaptations. And, I haven't read the original source material, so for all I know, these particular plot elements are actually in the original story. But regardless of that, it's still stupid. And it really undermined the enjoyment that I had watching the first half of the film. Another issue I had, and this was a smaller problem, pun intended, it was the dwarves. Now, the dwarves are not super well characterized in this version of the story. The original 7 dwarves from the original animated film, being Doc, Happy, Grumpy, Sneezy, Bashful, Sleepy, and Dopey, are all very well characterized and well fleshed out in the narrative. And by comparison, the 7 dwarves in this film, being Smarty, Hugabug, Rumbles, Tumbles, Pika, Paka, and Pook, not joking, those are all their names, just feel less developed. And to be fair, this film is half an hour shorter than the original animated film. And also 7 characters is a lot to juggle. But still, for a lot of the story, it just feels like they're kind of there. Like, out of the 7 of them, really only 3 of them get any sort of solid characterization. Like, Rumbles is very clearly like the main dwarf. He's kind of like the doc stand-in in this particular version of Snow White. Smarty, as a dwarf, is actually called Smarty ironically, because his character is kind of clumsy in the film and makes a lot of dumb decisions. Like when he accidentally sets off an explosion when he's trying to light his pipe. And Tumbles spends the entire film just trying to do one trick, a barrel roll. So we get characterization for those 3, but it's kinda lacking. And another problem I have with the dwarves, and this is actually related to their size, it's very clear that these dwarves are just full-sized men. Like, they didn't hire little people for this movie, they just hired below average height guys and had them, like, squat or kneel in certain scenes with other characters. It's very noticeable. And yeah, I get it, not all dwarf characters are built equal, but they make a point of showing in this film that they have small plates and that they have small beds, so they should be smaller characters. And I'm just sitting here thinking, why didn't you hire little person actors? I mean, even if you didn't want to do that, you could have also just done a forced perspective trick. Like, I don't know how much this movie cost, so I don't know how reasonable it would have been for them to go out of their way to build oversized sets, like in Lord of the Rings. But I think it would have gone a long way to actually make these dwarves look of a certain stature. Like, there's actually a Disney movie that came out a couple years before this version of Snow White called Darby O'Gill and the Little People. And in that film, they actually went out of their way to build oversized sets and film full-size actors a distance away from other actors to give the illusion of them being smaller. So considering that the cinematic techniques did in fact exist at the time, it feels a bit like, what are you doing here? Of course, I don't want to be entirely negative about this, because there are elements of this movie that I actually really enjoy. For one thing, I think the fact that this film is shorter than the original Disney version allows it to tell a tighter story that doesn't really waste your time. And unlike the original Disney film, it actually does add in extra story elements that help flesh out the narrative better. Like the fact that after the huntsman brings back a fake animal heart to the evil queen to fool her, she banishes him, which you don't see in the original Disney film. Also in the original Disney film, he gives her like a pig heart, while in this version, he gives her like a bear heart. And in the Disney version, it makes more sense because pig organs are very similar to human organs. But in any case, after the evil queen banishes the huntsman in this film, he goes to work for Prince Charming. And the two of them together set out on a journey to find Snow White, which makes more sense. And that also leads to another element of the story that I think is done quite well, being the love story. Kinda. Like, the love story of Snow White between her and Prince Charming is kinda just consistently lacking, but this particular version is slightly better than the Disney version, if for no other reason than the fact that the prince in this film is an actual character. Like, he has scenes to develop, actions that sort of depict his personality. He isn't just a guy that shows up at the beginning of the movie and then at the end of the movie. Like, he has stuff going on. And the fact that he brings the huntsman into his service helps to utilize both characters in a way that the original Disney film just didn't, which I think works. Aside from that, I also feel like the aesthetic in this film is absolutely wonderful. Just the music and the costumes and the very vibrant colors that you see in the film, it all adds to like this sense of whimsy that you need for a fairy tale film. And I also love the fact that the costumes and sets kind of make the film look like a theater production. It just really lends itself to the storybook vibe. And another element of the film that I think is kind of funny is the fact that the Mandela effect remains intact in this movie. To give you all a reminder, back in like 2013, the famous activist Nelson Mandela died of old age. And after his death, a lot of people started having these weird clashing memories of him actually dying in the 90s. And this event led to several other instances in popular culture where people realized the things that they remembered they were actually misremembering, like Berenstain Bears versus Berenstain Bears, or Shazam versus Kazam. And a big one was that everyone remembered the evil queen saying, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" when in the original film it's "Magic mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all." And in this version of Snow White, which came out nearly 25 years after the original Disney animated film, they say "Mirror, mirror on the wall." Now granted, it says "Mirror, mirror" in the subtitles of the film. I don't personally speak German, so maybe someone who actually does can listen closely and tell me if it actually is Mirror on the Wall. Here it is.
Spieglein, Spieglein an der Wand. Wer ist die Schönste im ganzen Land?
In either case, though, it's really interesting that this particular Mandela effect goes back that far, over 60 years ago. It's crazy. I love it. As a side note, I also love the fact that whenever the magic mirror in this movie talks, it lights up like a game show board. I like that. I like that aesthetic. I think it's interesting. In any case, though, over the course of this video, I've sort of talked a lot about the similarities and differences that this film has to the original Disney animated film. But while I have made these comparisons, it is still important to recognize that this is a different adaptation of the source material. And I think an element of the plot that highlights those differences the most would be the actual ending of the film. Obviously, the way the original Disney animated film ends, Prince Charming comes, delivers true love's kiss to the sleeping Snow White, and carries her off to live happily ever after. Literally. But in this movie, you get a little bit of an epilogue after Snow White wakes up. You see, after Snow White wakes up in this version, after the character of Smarty trips over a rock, the prince goes to comfort her and ask for her hand in marriage. Now, it's not exactly explained in this scene how dropping the glass coffin wakes Snow White up, but you know, at least it's not something like, I don't know, the prince kissing the unconscious body of a sleeping woman. Of course, that's aside from the point. You see, at this point in the story, Snow White has been tricked 3 times by the evil queen, and it's become apparent in the narrative, as well as painfully repetitive, that the evil queen is not going to give up targeting Snow White. So the prince comes up with a master plan to get back at the evil queen. You see, the prince proposes to Snow White and says that they should get married a week from that day. And they let this royal wedding become a publicly known event. That way word of it can actually reach the evil queen. And when the evil queen shows up to the wedding, she's startled to see that Snow White is still alive. And in that moment, Prince Charming hands her half of an apple. Which, you know, is symbolic because the evil queen poisoned Snow White with an apple. The queen is disturbed by the event and she chooses to run away. And the prince at this moment has proclaimed that now the evil queen is banished from human society. The dwarves then come in for the wedding to congratulate Prince Charming and Snow White. Tumbles does the barrel roll that he's been wanting to do the whole movie, and then the film ends. And suffice to say, this ending is very different than the animated film. And it is one of those situations where comparing the two films to try to decide which one is better doesn't work, because these are different adaptations of the story with different presentation. In the original animated film, the evil queen's death is sort of conveyed as this sense of cosmic justice. She's trying to crush the dwarves with a big rock, and then a bolt of lightning strikes the cliff she's standing on, leading her to descend to her death. And it's meant to be like sort of this twist of karma. And while it is sort of this grand epic finale, it also doesn't really have any personal connection between her and the central characters of the film. Meanwhile, in this version, the downfall of the evil queen is not the result of cosmic forces, it's the result of the main characters actually working against the queen. And instead of death, her punishment is being socially ostracized, which is actually even worse for her character based on how vain she is and the way that she's been built up in this story. I mean, she's basically a spoiled Karen. But the thing is that no matter which ending you prefer, whether it be the animated film's version or this one, both are valid to the stories that are being told in their respective films. And with this version specifically, I also think it does highlight something about German culture. Like I said, I've never read the original fairy tale, but I imagine that this particular ending for the evil queen is just meant to be so humiliating. Because in a way, it's like this ultimate moral justice that's been delivered to her by society for her terrible behavior. And I think that that ending, while it doesn't have the same scope of the animation, does an amazing job of tying together the narrative of this particular film adaptation. Which is ultimately the most important point to bring up, how this particular movie stands on its own. And, yeah, does a pretty good job. Like, if you're asking me which version I prefer, this or the Disney animated one, I can't really say, because even though they're extremely similar, they're also different enough and both have their own peaks and valleys. Like I said, I do think that this film does retain a sense of whimsy about it. I love the aesthetic, I love the tone, and something that I haven't even brought up yet is the cinematography. This film has really dynamic camera work. There's so many long shots in scenes that are constantly moving. And there's smooth camera movements as well. It doesn't look like handheld motion. Like, that genuinely impressed me watching this movie. And it really helped with the flow and the overall pacing of the narrative, the fact that things were constantly moving. And like I said, I do find Snow White's character in this movie to be incredibly charming, likable, and kind. The evil queen? I mean, she's a villain. She's not particularly a compelling villain, but you can laugh at her. Like, I think she's a very silly character. And I do think that is partially by design. Like, I did complain about her being stupid earlier, because I think she is kind of stupid. But I think that is kind of the point. Like, they don't build up the evil queen to be this sinister antagonist in the narrative. Like, they kind of just build her up to be like a spoiled And I think that probably is supposed to be a commentary on aristocracy, and how corrupt and selfish they can be. Which, once again, classic German storytelling. Like I said, the dwarves aren't super well characterized, but they're fun. They're good comic relief characters, which is what they should be. And something else I found funny about the film, and I don't know if this is a cultural distinction or just a mistake, but every character in the film acts very nonchalant about the sometimes life and death situations that they're in. Like, there's not really a sense of urgency from most of the characters in life or death situations, and it's really weird. Like, when the huntsman tells Snow White that he was ordered to kill her, like, she doesn't really react in a panicked way, and that is before he reveals that he's not actually going to do it. And when the evil queen finds out that Snow White is alive, over and over again, while she's angry, she doesn't seem overly bothered about it. She seems like she's more annoyed. And I don't know if that is an acting mistake or an intentional decision. Because it'd be easy to just say, oh, well, the actors are just doing a bad job, they're giving flat performances. But there are emotional line reads in this movie, as well as a cheerful and jovial vibe. Like, people are happy and cheerful in this film. So the fact that they are so nonchalant about really intense things, I do find interesting. So yeah, I would say that overall I really do enjoy this version of Snow White. Like I said, I feel like the only real problem with the film is just the repeated failed assassination attempts on Snow White. Like, it's not only frustrating and repetitive, but it actively makes the characters in the movie look more stupid. Like, it forces you to lose respect for them. Still, regardless of that fact, it's really not enough to ruin this movie, and I can't say that I regretted watching Snow White. At the end of the day, this is a fun and wholesome fantasy film. And I do think that the fact that this particular film adaptation was made in the country of origin for the original story really helps this film to feel authentic. And I can happily say that this is yet another German film that I do enjoy. And to all my German viewers, I hope me talking about this film just brought you a wonderful sense of nostalgia. Oh no, sorry, I mean Ostalgie. Look it up. And who knows, maybe I'll do a review for the West German version somewhere down the line. Maybe I'll do it if they actually get around to releasing the Daily Wire Republican Snow White at some point. So yeah, that was my review of the East German version of Snow White, or Schneewittchen. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. Please, I beg you, if you've actually gone out to see the new Disney live-action Snow White, comment below letting me know how it is, because I'm actually curious to see if the East German version is better. And, I will talk to you later. Okay, I just wanted to bring up one final thing to hammer home my love of German films. If you were at all curious about the title of this video, Do Communists Have Better Fairy Tales? That's a reference to the East German documentary, Do Communists Have Better Sex? Which is actually pretty good, by the way, I'd recommend it. And yes, I know the German title is Did the East Love Differently? But everyone has clickbait. What can be said?